The day I realized some people think money gives them permission to touch things they don't own started with a sunset. Not an argument, not a letter, not even a complaint, just a sunset that looked wrong. I remember pulling into my driveway after a long Tuesday at work, tired enough that all I wanted was a cold drink and 30 minutes of silence before making dinner. My property sat outside a small town called Pine Hollow, tucked against the lower side of a ridge covered with old cedar and maple trees. I'd lived there for almost 12 years. The trees were one of the reasons I bought the place in the first place. They weren't just landscaping. They were privacy. They were shade. They were the reason my backyard felt like a retreat instead of another house packed into another neighborhood. So when I stepped out of my truck and noticed the evening light flooding across my yard in a way it never had before, I immediately felt something was off. At first I couldn't figure out why. Then I looked toward the rear property line and my stomach dropped. The tree line wasn't whole anymore. There was a gap where there had never been a gap. I started walking faster, then almost jogging. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Huge sections of branches had been cut away from the uphill side of several mature trees. Fresh cuts, bright wood exposed, sap still glistening. Somebody had been there recently, very recently. For a minute, I just stood there staring. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused. You know how sometimes something is so unexpected your brain refuses to process it? That was me. I kept thinking maybe a storm had rolled through while I was at work. Maybe a utility company had some kind of emergency access. Maybe there was some explanation that made sense. But the more I looked, the less sense it made. Every cut was clean. Every branch had been removed from the exact same side of the trees. Whoever did it wasn't trying to save the trees. They were trying to create a view. And suddenly I knew exactly who benefited from that view. Above my property sat a luxury development called Summit Ridge. Big custom homes, oversized windows, outdoor fireplaces, infinity decks hanging off the hillside like something out of a real estate commercial. Most of the people who moved there came from the city. They paid a premium for mountain air and valley views. The problem was that my trees had been growing long before those houses existed. Their million-dollar sunsets had always included a few hundred feet of my cedar branches. Apparently somebody had decided they were tired of looking at them. I walked back inside, still trying to convince myself there had to be a misunderstanding, and pulled up my security camera footage. What I found erased any remaining doubt. At 10:07 that morning, a white utility truck entered through a maintenance path behind my property. Two men got out carrying chainsaws. No company logo. No markings. No attempt to contact me. No hesitation. They moved like people who already knew exactly what they were there to do. I watched nearly 40 minutes of footage with my jaw clenched tighter every second. Branch after branch came down. They worked quickly and professionally, which somehow made me even angrier. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. Somebody hired them. Somebody paid for this. Somebody believed they had the right to alter my property without even knocking on my door. Before the truck left, I zoomed in on the license plate and wrote the number down. Then I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window at the damaged trees while the sun disappeared behind the ridge. That's when something else started bothering me. This wasn't the first strange thing I'd noticed since Summit Ridge was built. Over the previous year, I'd caught myself feeling watched while working in my backyard. Every now and then I'd look uphill and see reflections from security cameras mounted near the neighborhood boundary. At the time I ignored it. People install cameras everywhere these days. But now, sitting there in the growing darkness, I found myself wondering if those cameras were looking at more than they were supposed to. The next morning I drove uphill to Summit Ridge. I wasn't looking for a fight. At least that's what I told myself. I just wanted answers. But deep down I already had a feeling this wasn't going to end with an apology. And as I rolled through the stone entrance toward the HOA office, I had no idea I was about to discover that the trees were only the beginning of the problem. The HOA office looked exactly like the kind of place you'd expect to find at the center of a neighborhood that took itself a little too seriously. Everything was spotless. Polished floors, expensive furniture, framed photographs of sunsets hanging on the walls, as if somebody had built an entire community around the idea of staring at the horizon. A woman named Denise greeted me with a practiced smile that somehow managed to feel both friendly and dismissive at the same time. I explained who I was and why I was there. The moment I mentioned the trees, her expression changed just enough for me to notice. Not surprise. Recognition. That was the first clue. She knew exactly what I was talking about before I finished my sentence. She invited me into her office and folded her hands neatly on the desk. "We believe there may have been some confusion regarding the vegetation along the boundary," she said. I remember actually laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because it was such a ridiculous way to describe what happened. "Confusion?" I asked. "Someone sent a crew onto my property and cut mature trees without permission." She adjusted a folder on her desk. Several homeowners had concerns about obstructed views. There it was. No denial. No apology. Just an explanation. Like the inconvenience of looking at my trees somehow justified trespassing. "That's unfortunate," I said, leaning forward. "But those trees belong to me." Denise nodded. "We understand your frustration." I hate that phrase. Whenever somebody says they understand your frustration, what they usually mean is they understand you're upset, but they don't intend to change anything. Then she offered what she apparently considered a reasonable solution. The HOA would reimburse me for the trimming costs. Trimming costs. As if somebody had simply shaped a hedge. I looked at her for several seconds before speaking. "Do you know how long it takes a cedar tree to grow back?" I asked. She didn't answer. "Do you know how long it takes privacy to grow back?" Still nothing. The silence said more than any apology could have. I left the office angry, but more importantly, I left suspicious. Because the entire conversation felt rehearsed. Nobody seemed shocked. Nobody seemed concerned about liability. Nobody even asked to see the footage. It was almost like they had already decided the issue was settled before I walked through the door. That afternoon, I pulled every property document I owned out of a filing cabinet. Surveys, deeds, easements, closing paperwork from when I bought the property. I spread everything across my dining room table and spent hours reviewing every line. The boundaries were crystal clear. The damaged trees were unquestionably on my land. No shared ownership. No gray area. No legal confusion. Just trespassing. But while I was reviewing those documents, another thought kept working its way into my head. The cameras. For years I had ignored them. Suddenly I couldn't stop thinking about them. The following morning, I walked the entire rear property line, carrying binoculars. What I found made my blood pressure jump. The security cameras weren't aimed at roads. They weren't aimed at entrances. They weren't monitoring community facilities. Most of them pointed downhill. Toward me. Toward my yard. Toward my house. One camera appeared to have a direct line toward the side of my bedroom. Another overlooked the patio where I spent most weekends reading. The more I examined them, the more uncomfortable I became. Then I noticed something even worse. Several camera poles had been installed right along the boundary. One appeared to extend slightly across the property line. Another projected far enough that portions of the mounting equipment crossed into my airspace. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who spends weekends looking for reasons to sue people. In fact, most of my life I've gone out of my way to avoid conflict. But there comes a point where avoiding conflict simply teaches people they can keep taking advantage of you. Standing there beneath those damaged trees, staring at cameras that never should have been pointed at my property in the first place, I realized this wasn't really about branches anymore. The trees were just the symptom. The real problem was entitlement. Somebody had decided their desire for a better view mattered more than my ownership rights. Somebody had decided my privacy was negotiable. That realization changed everything. By Friday, I hired a licensed surveyor named Victor. Victor was one of those guys who looked like he'd spent 30 years arguing with property lines and winning. He arrived carrying stacks of equipment and the kind of confidence that only comes from being right for a living. We spent nearly an entire day reviewing maps and measurements. Late that afternoon, he stood beside one of the camera poles, looked at me, and said, "Well, they're not going to like this." Those might have been the most satisfying words I'd heard all week. Monday morning, bright orange survey stakes appeared all along the boundary. You could see them clearly from every deck and balcony in Summit Ridge. Tuesday, my attorney sent certified letters to both the HOA and several homeowners whose properties directly overlooked mine. The letters addressed the unauthorized tree removal, the camera placements, potential privacy violations, and multiple boundary concerns. Wednesday morning, my phone started ringing. I ignored every call. Thursday, more calls came in. Some polite, some nervous. One homeowner left a voicemail insisting there had been a misunderstanding and suggesting we resolve things, neighbor to neighbor. Funny how people suddenly become interested in being neighbors when lawyers get involved. By then I had already made another decision. If they wanted a view badly enough to trespass onto my property, I was going to make sure they understood exactly where my property began and ended. Early Friday morning, a construction crew arrived. Trucks, materials, equipment. By lunchtime, the first steel posts were going into the ground. Around 2 o'clock, I noticed movement on the ridge above. Homeowners had started gathering on their balconies. Watching, pointing, talking. The irony wasn't lost on me. People who spent years watching my property suddenly seemed very interested in what was happening on it. The project moved fast. Every measurement followed the survey exactly. Every permit was approved. Every installation complied with local regulations. There was nothing flashy about the structure taking shape, but it was impossible to ignore. 8-foot steel privacy panels. Solid, clean, modern, legal, and most importantly, perfectly positioned. As the sections went up one after another, something remarkable happened. The camera angles disappeared. The sightlines vanished. The open view toward my backyard became a wall of steel. By late afternoon, the transformation was impossible to miss. Where there had once been an unobstructed look into my property, there was now privacy. Complete privacy. My phone rang shortly before 5. This time I answered. The caller introduced himself as Randall Mercer, president of the Summit Ridge HOA. His voice was calm, but it sounded like somebody making a serious effort to stay calm. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I think we need to discuss this fence." I looked out the window at workers installing another panel. "What's there to discuss?" I asked. "Several residents feel the structure is excessive." I smiled. Several residents didn't seem concerned about excessive tree trimming. There was a pause. "The cameras are for neighborhood security," he said. "Interesting," I replied. "Because security cameras usually point toward the neighborhood they're securing, not toward somebody else's bedroom window." The silence that followed lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. For the first time since this whole mess started, somebody on their side finally understood they weren't dealing with a homeowner who planned to quietly accept whatever explanation they offered. And before that conversation was over, something in Randall's tone changed. The confidence was gone. What replaced it sounded a lot like concern. That phone call ended politely enough, but the shift was impossible to miss. Up until that moment, Summit Ridge had treated me like an inconvenience, a guy living below the ridge whose property happened to be standing between them and a prettier view. Now they were finally looking at the situation through a different lens. They weren't worried about trees anymore. They were worried about liability. They were worried about evidence. Most of all, they were worried about what would happen if everything sitting in my lawyer's file ever made its way into a courtroom. The fence construction continued through the weekend, and every panel that went up seemed to increase the pressure on the people above me. By Monday morning, I received an email requesting a formal meeting. By Monday afternoon, that request had turned into 3 separate requests. On Tuesday, before I even had a chance to respond, a familiar white utility truck pulled into my driveway. This time nobody snuck onto my property. This time the workers got out, walked to my front door, and knocked. I opened the door to find a landscape contractor standing there holding a folder. "We're here on behalf of Summit Ridge," he said. "We've been authorized to restore the damaged trees and address any concerns regarding privacy screening." Funny how quickly people discover manners when expensive attorneys become involved. Over the next several days, crews planted mature native trees, installed additional privacy vegetation, reinforced damaged root zones, and provided written guarantees covering replacement costs if any of the new growth failed. The HOA paid for everything. Every single dollar. Then came the camera issue. One by one, the poles were relocated. Mounting systems were adjusted. Viewing angles were changed. A few cameras disappeared entirely. By the end of the week, not a single device pointed toward my home anymore. A formal apology arrived shortly afterward. Not the kind of apology people give because they're sorry. The kind they give because somebody advised them it was the smartest legal option. Still, I accepted it. Not because I believed every word, but because the outcome mattered more than the performance. A few weeks later, I was sitting on my patio with a cup of coffee, watching the evening sun settle behind the hills. The damaged sections of the tree line were already beginning to recover. The new plantings would take time, but for the first time since everything started, the property felt like mine again. Quiet, private, peaceful. That's when my neighbor Earl stopped by. Earl had lived in Pine Hollow longer than almost anybody. After hearing the entire story, he shook his head and laughed. "You know," he said, "most people would have just taken the check." I laughed too. Maybe he was right. Taking the money would have been easier. It would have been faster. It definitely would have been less stressful. But some things aren't really about money. They're about boundaries. They're about respect. The moment somebody decides your property rights matter less than their convenience, the issue becomes bigger than a few trees. Looking back now, I don't think the people in Summit Ridge ever saw themselves as villains. Most people don't. They probably convinced themselves they were solving a problem, improving a view, protecting property values, doing what everyone else wanted. But that's exactly how entitlement works. It rarely announces itself. It just quietly assumes that someone else's rights are negotiable. In the end, I got my privacy back. The trees were restored. The cameras were moved. The fence stayed exactly where it was. And every time I look at it, I don't see steel panels. I see a reminder that sometimes the most effective response isn't anger, revenge, or a screaming match. Sometimes it's simply knowing your rights, documenting everything, and refusing to back down when somebody with more money assumes that means they have more authority. But here's the part people still argue about whenever I tell this story. Some say the fence was too much. Others say it was exactly what needed to happen. A few insist I should have accepted the reimbursement and moved on. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. Honestly, I'm still not sure where that line is myself. What I do know is this. Nobody from Summit Ridge has touched a single branch on my property since. And if you were in my position, after someone cut your trees without permission because they wanted a better view, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the apology and the money, or would you have fought back the same way? Let me know down in the comments because this one still starts arguments every time it comes up. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes good fences don't make bad neighbors, but sometimes they make necessary ones.